All right, we'll give everyone like one more minute to, thanks for saying hi. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is coming from, especially to see who we've got and what kind of perspectives you all will bring. So that's great. All right, and then I just sort of before we move into the next presentation, I want to take a quick break and find out if there are any questions that anyone has before we move on. You can put them in the chat or just speak up if you would like. I'm going to end this. All right, if there aren't any questions, I don't think there are. If you think of something, feel free to put it in the chat. But Laura, I think we can move on to your presentation whenever you're ready.
Okay, I have to go back to my screen sharing. We're going to get there. And share. Am I up properly, Laura? Yep. Okay, good morning, everyone. I am diving you into the information overload that you're going to get for the first half of this before we move into breakout groups, but we're monitoring the chat. So please, if there are any questions that come up, jump in and share those because we want to make sure that you are set up to be as engaged as possible in the breakout sessions and in this whole process, because really climate change planning on the mitigation and the adaptation side, I'll talk more about that in a second, is something that is how we deal with planning and local decision-making in perpetuity. So we want to share as many of the approaches and ideas that are out there with you so that you're set up to make climate savvy decisions going forward. So I'm going to be giving you an overview introduction to adaptation and most importantly, the vulnerability assessment aspect of adaptation, because that's what we're going to be working on today. Oh, and a small aside, huge fan of lacrosse. I grew up just south of you all in Iowa and spent my summers in Wisconsin every year. So really excited to be diving back into learning about what's going on in the region. So the key points I'm going to talk about in my presentation are understanding the difference between adaptation and mitigation. You'll get a little quiz on that to make sure that you're getting it. There'll be an overview of understanding vulnerability and then getting you to adaptation, because while I'm predominantly talking about vulnerability assessment today, I feel like it's a little bit of malpractice if I don't start preparing you for developing the solutions, because that's really the goal. You don't just want to understand your problem, you want to know how to be part of fixing it. Okay, so let's jump into what is adaptation. So mitigation is probably the part of climate change response that people are most familiar with. So mitigation is what we do to decrease the potential of climate change itself. This is addressing the causes, the root causes, with a focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is especially things like transportation. So driving single occupancy, fossil fuel powered vehicles less, using less energy overall, so energy conservation, using less energy in your electricity use at home, using less energy, ceasing to use things like natural gas or propane, and doing whatever can be done to increase carbon uptake and storage by systems, both human engineered and natural. And then adaptation is how we prepare for, respond to, and recover from the changes that we're already experiencing and expected to experience. So this is addressing the impacts of climate change with a focus on managing that change in a manner that allows you to continue to achieve the goals you have or to achieve adjusted goals when you recognize that there may be some things that cannot be met anymore. This is an example of Santa deciding that he needs to adapt by relocating. So now I'm going to do my little quiz for you. And if everyone can turn on their cameras, that's the best way for this to work. And I need to come up with a way to see more of you while I'm doing this. I'm going to ask you to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to whether or not what I'm showing and asking is adaptation. And I guess you could also put it in the chat if in fact your camera isn't working. So the first question is zoning to require flood tolerant design elements in floodplains. Based on what I've just given you as the definitions of adaptation and mitigation, is this adaptation? Okay, I see all of the thumbs that I see appear to be up. Oops. Excellent. You are correct. That is adaptation. Nice work. Oh, nice solid work with the indicator. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's a thumbs down indicator, but if someone finds it, you can use that too. Okay, the second one is requiring solar panels on all new development. Is this adaptation? Yes or no? Okay, we have a little bit of a mixture here. And the winner is no, it is not adaptation, it is mitigation. You could come up with a long way around to say that it's adaptation. Oh, excellent, you found a thumbs down icon. Very happy about that. You could do a long trip around to say that it's adaptation by saying that if in fact the power grid is undermined by increasing temperatures and demand, and you needed to come up with distributed generation, it could in fact be an adaptation if you went that long trip. But in general, the basics of it are that it's mitigation. You're doing something to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the generation of energy from the combustion of fossil fuels. Okay, next one. Oh, this is hard. I have too many window things open and I can't figure out where my tab is. Okay, is this adaptation? Planting trees, yes or no? Okay, we have a solid mixture of thumb directions, and Casey is doing the side thumb issue. Nice work, Casey. This is a trick question. This could be adaptation or mitigation. You really need more information with this. It's adaptation if the trees are suitable for changing conditions for the coming decades. If you're planting trees that are already disappearing in your region, that would certainly not be adaptation. If you're planting trees that are good for the future and can help with an array of things, including creating more shade or stabilizing soils, that's all great adaptation stuff. They could also be for mitigation. If the trees and the soil will increase our carbon uptake, that would be a mitigation measure with the trees. If you're just doing it for landscaping, albeit doomed landscaping, if it's neither of the above, then it's also not adaptation. So it could be adaptation, mitigation, or doomed landscaping were the three analyses that I came up with for that. Okay, that is the end of your quiz. You guys did great. Thank you so much for participating. Next slide. And I need to figure out how to make this. I've made the window with your images really big. Okay, so to recap, this would be mitigation, would be snow people putting solar panels on themselves and wind turbines. Whoa. This would be adaptation if all snow people got moved into the refrigerated skiing tunnel, although it would be a terrible use of energy unless it was also powered by some sort of solar system. And then this would be inaction. And I want you to keep that idea of inaction in mind as well. Often when people don't know what to do about something, they choose to do nothing. And I want to be clear that doing nothing is also an action. It's called inaction, and it has consequences, as you can see for the snowman in the bucket. Okay, so how do you adapt to climate change? One of the first steps is a vulnerability assessment, but even before that is what Ted was talking about. This meeting and some previous ones have been about, which is knowing your goals and understanding the hazards related to them. You need to know what it is you're trying to design an adaptation strategy for, or a mitigation strategy to protect before you start it. Then you assess your vulnerabilities, what we'll be doing today. Then you have to develop adaptation strategies to reduce those vulnerabilities. Then you have to implement your actions and track how well they work so that you can use the tracking to update your understanding and modify approaches as needed. This is going to be a continuous thing as we go forward, because one of the either exciting or frustrating things about climate change, depending on how you look at it, is that we are always learning new things and it is a changing condition. So we need to be seeing how things are responding and respond accordingly. So knowing your goals is pretty simple stuff, although it's shocking how long this can sometimes take. You need to identify your goals and the desired outcomes you have of the process, identify key stakeholders, identify climate change, climate and non-climate stressors, identify important community assets. And I put that in quotes because that could be anything from community resources to the people who live in the community, to the natural systems, to businesses, whatever it is that you've decided you want to prioritize the protection of. And then you have to set a time frame. What time frame are you looking to gather information about, and what timeline do you need this thing to function? The functional timeline of a lemonade stand versus a sewage treatment plant is dramatically different. You need to plan at different time horizons for how that needs to be designed given the realities of climate change. The second step is assessing your vulnerabilities, and this is going to be the focus of most of what I'm going to talk to you about. So vulnerability can be thought of as the degree to which natural, built, and human systems are susceptible to harm. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change goes on to say it's a function of sensitivity of a particular resource to climate change, its exposure to those changes, and its capacity to adapt to those changes. I'll go into a little bit more of that in a moment, and I'll be doing some translation from sensitivity and exposure to likelihood and consequence. The purpose of a vulnerability assessment is to identify what is most vulnerable. So those are those people, places, assets, elements, anything, and why in order to develop an adaptation response. So we want to identify what and why it's vulnerable. So this is the model that the world of science uses. You consider likelihood and consequence, which again, I said are the same as sensitivity and exposure, to determine a potential impact or risk, as it's sometimes called. You then consider that in conjunction with that adaptive capacity, the ability of something to respond to get to your vulnerability. So likelihood is the degree to which an element or asset is exposed to significant changes in climate. How likely will it be that an asset will be exposed to a given climate hazard? So what are those? I'll be breaking this down even further for you. Secondly, is the consequence or the sensitivity, the degree to which an element or asset is affected by that exposure to a changing climate. So how significant is the effect of the climate impact? To what end is it? The adaptive capacity is the ability to adjust to a climate change, to moderate potential damage, and to take advantage of opportunities or cope with consequences. And in the world of climate adaptation planning and assessment, that turns into an equation for those of you who are mathematically minded, and that is vulnerability equals the likelihood times the consequence minus the adaptive capacity. So you can think of the world of climate change responses as how do you decrease likelihood, decrease consequence, and increase adaptive capacity. So to assess vulnerability, you want to identify the current and projected future changes in climate factors or hazards. You want to identify what the impacts of those changes are, and you want to characterize the current ability to moderate or cope with the impact. So if I were to turn that into how you would think about this, you'd first identify those climate hazards, which could be things like increasing intense precipitation events or increasing temperature. And I have a picture up in the upper right-hand corner of apparently a flood that recently occurred in Crosse. So if that's in front of anybody's house, I apologize for using it without your permission. Then you consider the impact of the climate hazard. So increased precipitation can lead to flooding. It can lead to disrupted transportation. It could lead to sewer and stormwater failure. It could lead to property damage. It could lead to compromised aging infrastructure. You can probably come up with a lot of other things that would be in this list as well. It could lead to, when you add in increasing temperatures along with that, it could lead to health impacts. Feel free to throw into the chat if there's something you desperately want to share that you see as another impact. We'd love to hear that. So what would address this hazard impact? There are a lot of entities in the La Crosse region that would help do, or in any community that would help to address these kinds of challenges. There are utilities, planning departments and existing zoning and code, transportation departments, insurance, emergency services, and property owners themselves would work to ameliorate any of these things. And that leads to a host of vulnerabilities. I will share one as an example. Was that expansion of areas vulnerable to severe flooding may result in additional locations that become inappropriate for development or redevelopment, or may increase costs associated with development. For example, due to increased costs of insurance, repair, or construction, or maybe even an inability to insure something, which can change the cost required for financing because you wouldn't be able to get a mortgage or a loan perhaps to develop an area if in fact it can't be insured. Two things that are in the chat. Someone brought up extinction of species. Yeah, you can absolutely lose critical habitat to changes like this. You may exceed a thermal threshold. You may in fact instigate the ability of a pest or a microbe. Issues around fungal disease are associated with some serious implications for species, including species like amphibians, interestingly enough. And then impacts to drinking water. Absolutely. The ability for drinking water treatment to carry on during flooding periods is a challenge across the country right now. Yep, more ticks. Yep, lots of things. This is great. Keep sharing those. We'll be capturing those and integrating them into the vulnerability assessment. Thank you so much. So then the vulnerability assessment allows you to really understand, okay, what is the challenge that is before us? You now have this vulnerability, and the next step in adaptation planning is you would like to know what to do about it. So you need to develop adaptation strategies to reduce those vulnerabilities, and you want them to specifically map. This is why it's really important when addressing climate change to do it in a methodical manner, because you need your response to map to your vulnerabilities. You don't just want to come up with what someone else sees as a good idea for how you respond to climate change. It needs to be really very local and very one-to-one. Or 2-to-1. Like if you can come up with a solution that addresses multiple things, that's even better. And you have the opportunity to rethink a lot of the structural ways that you've designed things that are being undermined and reconsider them. And this is a great pathway into addressing systemic inequities that you may have in your systems, because they're being opened wide up right now. So let's revisit how that can be addressed, perhaps. It also lets you readdress bad resource management decisions. And there's a lot of that that's been going on as well. For example, moving to more nature-based solutions away from gray infrastructure that have been causing problems with natural system management. So social and natural system opportunities. So climate change adaptation refers to adjustments in natural or human systems in response to changing climate conditions. And again, going back to what I said earlier, you can think of them as ways to reduce the impacts of climate change. So that's the likelihood and the consequence, and increase system responsiveness. That's the adaptive capacity. And all of that allows you to reduce your overall vulnerability, because those are the factors that are how vulnerability is assessed. Then you actually have to implement the plan. I cannot tell you how many adaptation plans there are around this country that are unimplemented. So the next vital step is to implement your actions and track how well they work. So you want to put your adaptation strategies into action, but as part of that, it's really important to come up with ways that you're going to monitor whether or not the program is proving effective. Is it in fact reducing the vulnerabilities? And you want to evaluate results to determine what is working and what is not, so that you can adjust as needed going forward and have ways to do that adjustment built into it. Because remember, taking no action to address vulnerability is an action, one that will result in outcomes, and those would be predictable outcomes, because you've just done that as part of your vulnerability assessment. You've identified what will happen if you do nothing, and therefore, if you do nothing, you are allowing that to happen. Adaptation is really important to think of as something you implement before the crisis. So make sure that you once you've developed this plan as part of this process, it's something you're really moving forward with, and you're not just holding on to and waiting until you do things get bad. Adaptation strategies have a much better likelihood of being successful if you can put them into play early. That is all I have on the introduction to vulnerability assessments. Laura is going to take you through some of what are the projections for the La Crosse region that are going to set you up on that first piece of the vulnerability assessment of understanding what are the likely things to happen. I'm happy to answer any questions, but otherwise we should move on to Laura's presentation.
Any questions for Laura before we move on? All right. Do you want to stop sharing your, there you go, thanks. All right, I will get mine loaded up. Okay. There's my monitor again. And all right, how does that look?
Looks great.
Great. All right, let me get my chat window and everything pulled up so that I can keep track of things. All right. Okay, so for this next piece, we're going to dive into the information and break down exactly what climate changes are likely to occur in La Crosse, and also take a look at what climate changes have already occurred over the past several decades. So the information that I'm going to cover, it's a lot of maps and data. So you don't need to worry about remembering all of it. It's all going to be in the vulnerability assessment document. And I'm also going to share these slides with you right after the workshop. You won't have the vulnerability assessment in your hands quite yet, but these slides can be available to you right away. So you'll have easy access to sort of refer back to it. So some of the main concerns for La Crosse are going to include things like higher average temperatures and more extreme heat events, so things like heat waves, overall wetter conditions, especially in the winter and the spring, increased frequency and intensity of extreme precipitation events, so extremely heavy rainfall within a short period of time, storms and severe floods, and then also more frequent and more severe droughts. So I'm going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail, but first I want to give you a quick overview of how we understand the data that's behind these trends and projections. So generally when we're talking about future climate change, sorry for that box. So we usually compare observed historical conditions with some benchmark future time periods. So usually something like the middle of the century and the late century. So because the conditions in any given year are variable, what we really do is use the average climate conditions within a certain time frame as our baseline. So for here, when we're talking about what we're comparing the future to, we're talking about this sort of recent historical time period, which is the yearly average between 1981 and 2010. And that range matches up with the source I got the data from for you. So the data I'm going to be providing to you comes from the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, or WICI for short. And they do some really great modeling and produce some lovely maps that you'll get to see. So the time periods I'm talking about are going to be the same as what they use for their climate models. So you have this historical time period, and that's what you're comparing the future to. And then the mid-century future conditions are the average of annual conditions between 2041 and 2060. Sorry, I didn't change those years correctly. And then the late century projections are the average of annual conditions between 2081 and 2100. So then we can also look at historical trends to identify changes that have already taken place over longer periods of time in the past. So WICI tends to look at the years between 1950 and 2020, so a 70-year time frame ending very recently. So when you're incorporating climate change into your planning, it's important to think about which of the future timeframes makes the most sense for whatever you're thinking about. So if you are doing planning around emergency systems, or if you're wanting to integrate climate change into your comprehensive plan or your hazard mitigation plan that are just looking at the next decade or two, then looking primarily at the changes for 2060 might make the most sense. But if you're talking about adaptation strategies that are focused on infrastructure that is expected to last for 50 or 100 years, then it's really important to look at climate change projections for the end of the century. Otherwise, you risk severely underestimating the kind of conditions that that building or that road is going to experience. So as we're looking at historical or projected changes for each of these stressors, there's a few things we're going to think about. The first is that we want to know the direction of change. So is a given climate stressor going to increase, decrease, or stay pretty much the same? The second thing to think about is the magnitude of change. So if there's an increase, is it a slight increase or a moderate or a really large increase? And then in addition to magnitude, we also want to think about other relevant information like shifts in seasonal timing or in interannual variability, so changes from year to year. And those things don't always show up in annual averages. So for instance, if you're thinking only about changes in annual precipitation or the total, which is the total amount of rain that you receive in a year, that might not tell us whether there's going to be a lot more rain in some seasons and less rain in other seasons, or whether there's going to be more variability from year to year. So the first of these sort of major climate stressors we're going to look at is air temperature. So this is the map from Wiki, and it shows historical trends in annual mean air temperature since 1950. So the star shows the location of La Crosse, where annual temperatures have increased by about 3 degrees over that 70-year time period from 1950 to 2020. However, that sort of annual change hides really big seasonal differences. So winter minimum temperatures have increased by 6 degrees, and summer maximum temperatures, so the average of the high temperature in the summer months, has only increased by 1 degree. And so then by mid-century, annual temperatures are expected to increase by about 6 degrees around La Crosse, and that's compared to the 1981 to 2010 time period. And again, you're going to see much faster increases in winter low temperatures, so up to 7 degrees, and slightly smaller increases in summer high temperatures. And then by the end of the century, annual temperatures around La Crosse could increase by a total of 11 degrees. And that's 12 degrees for winter low temperatures and 10 degrees for winter summer high temperatures. Another thing to think about, and this is particularly relevant for agriculture and native plant communities, is this map shows the number of nights with frost, so nights with low temperatures that dip below 32 degrees. So around La Crosse, there were about 140 nights of frost per year between 1981 and 2010. By the middle of the century, that's going to decrease by about 14% to 120 nights per year. And then by the end of the century, a 29% decrease to about 100 nights per year. So that could have significant implications for plants that have evolved to require a certain sort of winter stratification period where there's cold temperatures for a certain period of time. So then in addition to overall increases in average temperatures, we're also likely to see really significant increases in days with extreme heat. So this map is looking at the average number of days each year that maximum temperatures are 90 degrees or higher. So you all are very lucky. Sort of in this recent historical period, you had only about 10 days over 90 degrees. By 2060, the average will be 35 days, which is a 250% increase. And then by 2100, it will be 45 days, which is a 350% increase. You can see that sort of an interesting pattern to notice is that there was a slightly smaller increase in summer high temperatures, but you're going to be seeing much more sort of extreme conditions. So lots and lots of very, very hot days. So the next thing we're going to look at is precipitation. Annual precipitation around the Crosse has already increased very significantly since 1950 by about 20%. And then these maps show the changes in each season. So you can see around the Crosse, it's been pretty consistent with 20% increases in the fall, the winter, and the spring, and slightly less significant increases in the summer, so about 15%. There's been much bigger seasonal differences in the northern part of the state. So they had very wet falls and winters, not much change in the spring, and drier overall conditions in the summer. By mid-century, annual precipitation around the Crosse is projected to increase by an additional 5% compared to the average from 1981 to 2010. And there's a sort of similar pattern of larger increases in the winter and the spring, smaller increases in the fall, and little or no change in the summer. Yeah, there's a question in the chat about predictions for wet bulb temperatures, so very high humidity. I wasn't able to find specific projections on humidity, but there are a couple of studies that suggest overall humidity is expected to increase. And we know as temperatures increase, the air can hold more water. And so I would expect to see higher humidity, but to my knowledge, no one is sort of modeling that exact thing. So then by the end of the century, annual precipitation will increase by an additional 5%, so to 10% compared to 1981 to 2010. That again will have the biggest increases in the winter of 20%, a little bit less, 15% in the spring, 10% in the fall, and no real change in the summer. And the projected increases in winter precipitation, which are up to 20%, those are likely to primarily occur as winter rain rather than snow. And you're probably going to see an overall shift in the proportion of winter precipitation that falls as rain instead of snow, especially in Wisconsin, where winter temperatures are expected to increase very, very significantly. And then there are a couple of studies that show, which is no big surprise, but by the end of the century, there are likely to be pretty significant decreases in the amount of snow that falls each year, as well as in the frequency, intensity, and duration of snowstorms. And that's primarily because of much higher temperatures. Oh yeah, Jamie says that you've already seen decreases in snow. Yeah, I wasn't able to find a clear answer on sort of historical trends in snowfall. I found a couple things that said it had gone higher and some that said lower. And so I think there's some more to dig into there, but it wouldn't surprise me at all that you've seen decreases, especially given what large changes have already occurred in winter low temperatures. So next I want to move on to what's probably one of La Crosse's biggest concerns, which are extreme events, and that includes storms and flooding. So the amount of rain that falls on the very wettest days of the year, the wettest 1% of days, has increased by 42% in the Midwest since 1958. And that trend is expected to continue. So we're going to be seeing more extreme precipitation events that are becoming even more extreme over the coming century. Another study found that the amount of precipitation that is associated with spring storms has increased over the last several decades, so by about 25% per decade. And that's primarily because of increases in the frequency, intensity, and duration of what they call mesoscale convective systems, which are basically large groups of thunderstorms that act together as sort of one huge storm system. And those are the kinds of storms that are sometimes associated with things like tornadoes or derechos. It is difficult to make long-term projections for sort of how storms like that will respond to climate change. And there really aren't studies that give us specific predictions about what will happen with storms. We do know, sort of, as I mentioned with humidity, that the sort of kind of conditions that come together to create really large storm systems are things like warm air temperatures, heat waves, and high humidity. And we know all of those things are going to increase. And so I think it's reasonable to assume that you're going to see extreme weather events, and specifically that sort of kind of extreme thunderstorms are going to become more common and potentially more extreme in the future. One thing that is modeled readily is extreme precipitation events. So these maps are looking at the number of days with precipitation over a certain amount. So here, this is the number of days per year when 24-hour precipitation totals are over 2 inches. So historically, there were 12 days with at least 2 inches of rain around the Crosse. By 2060, that's expected to increase by 25%. So you have around 15 days with at least 2 inches of rain, and then a 50% increase by 2100 to around 18 days per year. Then if you look at even more extreme precipitation events, so these are days with precipitation totals of at least 5 inches, which is a huge amount of rain. Historically, that's occurred only about twice a year for La Crosse. So by 2060, that's expected to increase by 100% to 4 days per year. And then by 2100, a 400% increase to 8 days per year. So you can see when you're comparing the rate of increase for days with 2 inches compared to days with 5 inches, the very most extreme events, so the days with 5 inches of precipitation, are going to increase much more and much faster than the sort of more typical heavy rain events. And the rate of increases in those heaviest, like most extreme events, are going to become even more significant in the later half of the century. So the rate of that increase is going to be increasing. Let's see. Oh, and then the last thing I wanted to mention was that I have not yet been able to find studies that specifically model long-term changes in severe flooding for Wisconsin. Certainly you can find short-term projections, so for the next year, what flooding will be like. But I'm hoping to poke around a little bit further and potentially find some of that information, especially as it relates to river flooding. If I do, I will include it in the final version of the vulnerability assessment. But in the meantime, we know that extreme precipitation is going to increase very significantly, and it's safe to assume that those extreme precipitation events are going to go along with severe floods. And based on the information that we covered, it's also pretty safe to say that the risk of that kind of severe flooding is probably going to be highest in the winter and the spring, which is when precipitation increases are expected to be the highest. And then the last factor I want to touch on is drought. So there aren't really any long-term drought projections for Wisconsin that I could find, but a number of different sources suggest that droughts are probably going to become more common even as overall precipitation increases. And that's because as temperatures get hotter, more water is lost through evaporation and plant transpiration. And so there can be a net loss of water in the system, even if sort of overall precipitation rates are increasing. And then also, as a greater proportion of rain within a given year is falling during extreme events, the swings between sort of wet periods and dry periods will probably become more extreme as well. So you are likely going to see droughts becoming more common, and even as overall precipitation increases.
Laura, there's a comment in the chat about RCP 4.5 versus RCP 8.5.
Oh, yeah, thank you for that comment. Yes, so the maps that are posted on the wiki website are based on the RCP 4.5 scenario, which, suggests is sort of a lower or moderate emission scenario that suggests some climate action has already taken place. I emailed wiki directly and asked for maps that reflected the higher emission scenario, which is the path that we're on right now. So the data that I just showed you is all actually the RCP 8.5 scenario, which is what we're on right now. And that's sort of the business as usual scenario. But those maps aren't the ones posted on their website. He sent me a Dropbox folder with all of them. Thanks for that question. I meant to mention that. Yeah, and someone mentions that rain will run off instead of soak in. Absolutely, that is a huge issue as sort of more rain is falling in heavy events and less sort of like distributed across the year. All right, any questions before we move on to the vulnerability assessment? There's been a few already, which are great. And I might have missed something in the chat as well. I am loving a lot of comments in the chat are already sort of moving on to the next step, which is sort of thinking through what the implications of these things will be, which is fantastic. All right, well, I will move on, and if there are questions, please do feel free to keep posting those. So the next presentation, we're going to talk about what all of those different changes are going to mean for La Crosse specifically. And we're going to do that primarily by breaking them down into the different sectors. So things like land use and housing, transportation, health and safety, food and agriculture. And those are the same set of sectors that TED is using for the remainder of the process. So it will all seem very familiar, hopefully. So before I talk about that, I want to touch on how climate change vulnerability is distributed within the community. So we know that climate change is going to impact everybody. It's going to affect them across social, economic, and political boundaries. But vulnerability to climate change isn't evenly distributed within a community. It tends to follow patterns, pre-existing patterns of inequity. So greater burdens of climate change are on people of color, low-income residents, non-English speakers, young children and the elderly, and other groups that might have historically experienced depression or other conditions like that. And those groups either have a greater, I'm not sure if this is going to work. Nope, it didn't. A greater likelihood of being exposed to climate changes. So perhaps they live in areas that are more exposed to climate change. They might experience more significant consequences of climate change, or they might have less ability to respond to those changes. So understanding and considering these disproportionate impacts that are experienced by some populations is absolutely critical as you move forward into the adaptation piece, because you need to ensure that the benefits of those strategies and actions you come up with are justly distributed. So the vulnerability assessment document is going to include a brief summary of how each of these different groups might be disproportionately impacted by climate change. So people of color, low-income residents, children 5 and under, the elderly, so that's defined as seniors 65 and over, individuals with disabilities, people with little or no English, at-risk workers, people in occupations that put them at higher risk of climate change, and people without access to a private vehicle. So, for example, it's widely known and unfortunately, very well documented that Black, Brown, Latinx, and Indigenous communities have faced decades of discriminatory zoning policies and other sort of urban planning practices. And there's also a historic lack of investment into their communities. And so those things, along with other impacts of systemic racism, like lower incomes or increased risk of chronic health conditions, means that people of color tend to be more likely to live in areas that are at higher risk of flooding or heat island effects, and that inadequate or poorly maintained infrastructure might mean that more damage occurs when there are extreme events. So each of these sections sort of has some examples along those lines, and also has one of these maps that shows how the members of that population are distributed within the different city census tracts. And that information comes from the American Community Survey. So this is an example of what those maps look like. So I want to give you some other examples. It's not a comprehensive list, but just to sort of get you thinking about sort of some of the ways that these disproportionate impacts of climate change might occur. So people may lack the financial resources to help them prepare for or respond to extreme events. And also damage or losses during those types of events can represent really significant financial hardships. So for instance, if someone doesn't have a lot of money or is food insecure and they lose a whole refrigerator full of food during a power outage, that can be a really, really huge hardship. Young children, the elderly, and people with chronic health conditions tend to have more difficulty regulating their body temperature. So they're at greater risk during things like heat waves. And they may also be more vulnerable to severe illness or disease. And then people with limited mobility, whether it's due to age, disability, or sort of lack of access to a private vehicle, might be less able to evacuate if there was an emergency. They might be less able to access cooling shelters during heat wave. Let's see. People with limited English might be less able to benefit from community resources and programs that help people prepare for climate change. They might be less able to understand or get instructions about what to do in case of an emergency, or help accessing resources following an extreme event. People who experience racism or other forms of discrimination might not feel able to use emergency shelters, or shelters may also be physically inaccessible to a subset of people. And then the last example is certain occupations place people at greater risk of exposure to things like extreme heat, flooding, low air quality, vector-borne disease, or other sort of climate-related hazards. Many of those jobs also tend to be low-wage jobs, and employers don't always offer adequate safety precautions or paid time off so that people can, sort of get out of the heat or avoid the hazard in another way. So the next thing I want to do is give you some examples of the sector-specific vulnerabilities that we came up with for this assessment. So they're divided into two categories in the vulnerability assessment. So things that are direct impacts of climate change, and then vulnerabilities that are more a result of interactions with existing stressors. So those are things like aging infrastructure, lack of affordable housing, changes in population dynamics, existing water pollution issues. So things that aren't a result of climate change, but might either exacerbate climate changes or the impacts of climate change, or be exacerbated by those changes. So we divided these vulnerabilities up into 9 sectors. And so those are the same as the ones that you'll be working with throughout the CAP process. So land use and housing, transportation and mobility, buildings and energy, waste management, water and wastewater, health and safety, local food and agriculture, green space and tree canopy, and the economy. So I'm going to go through and give you some examples of vulnerabilities that are listed in the assessment for each of these sectors. This isn't an exhaustive list, so there are lots of things that I'm not going to mention, but we'll be working with these more in the breakout group, so you will have an opportunity to review fully the information for a subset of these sectors. So the first one is land use and housing. So some examples of vulnerabilities would be changes in patterns of energy use and associated costs that are due to warmer winters and hotter summers. So you might see especially significant increases in the energy demand during the summer as people rely on air conditioning more and more. Increased heat stress in developed areas, especially in areas where impervious surfaces or a lack of vegetation create heat islands. Reduced suitability or changes in the suitability of some areas. So for instance, areas at high risk of flooding, maybe riverfront properties. So reduced suitability of some of those areas for certain land uses like residential or commercial due to severe flooding. And that might include areas along waterways, floodplains, or low-lying areas with poor drainage. Increased migration of climate refugees from more impacted communities into La Crosse, and that can exacerbate existing challenges related to the lack of vacant land for development of sort of new housing areas. And an increased risk of damage or structural failure in infrastructure that is already deteriorating or homes during severe flood events. Yeah, there's a comment from Lewis that we might want to think about cross-sector vulnerabilities. That is absolutely the case, and there are a lot of things that are going to be sort of like listed in multiple places. Lewis, do you want to give an example of what you mean when you say cross-sector?
Well, I know in terms of urban planning, like land use and transportation really go hand in hand and feed back into each other. So, I mean, it's just something to consider. I don't have any like specific thoughts right now, but just either something to talk about later or within the breakout sessions is like, if we're focusing on one thing, how does it relate to the other things? And Kathy also brought up earlier, like transportation and agriculture, like shipping emissions from food in California was just an example. But that's something we can think about, and I'm sure people will hopefully naturally come up with anyway.
Yeah, there you will see definitely some of that already. So an example, I believe the sort of land use and housing section talks about vulnerabilities related to some neighborhoods being more isolated or increased isolation if roads are flooded. And then of course, that's also a sort of in the transportation section as well. So that might be an example. And then, yeah, also pieces about sort of supply chains and transport of goods applies under the agriculture and transportation section. So definitely talk about that more in the breakout groups, and you can see what's already there and maybe make it sort of provide additional input into things that are missing or sort of connections you want to make between those different sectors. Okay, so for transportation and mobility, some examples are reduced interest in walking and biking as summers become hotter and hotter. So you'd see an increased dependence on cars and public transportation systems that have air conditioning. Increased heat stress in residents that have to navigate lengthy public transportation routes or people who live farther from the nearest bus stop. I guess that's kind of a cross-sector example with public health issues, public health and transportation connected there. Increased frequency and severity of damage to roads or other infrastructure during flood events, especially where culverts and bridges aren't designed to accommodate future conditions, so the amount of stormwater that's going to occur under sort of future extreme events. Decreased river flows during dry periods or times of drought, which can impact river transportation and commerce. And an example of sort of a factor that interacts with, pre-existing stressors, you have sort of this historical investment in car-focused transportation that's resulted in more interest in suburban areas and reduced walkability within the center of the city. And that's going to complement future changes that you want to make to increase how easy or desirable it is to use public and non-motorized transportation. So the next sector is buildings and energy. So you'd see increased demand for electricity, especially during the summers, straining capacity and leading to higher costs and potential power outages. Increased damage to buildings and associated infrastructure, power outages, disruption to critical services required for like the functioning of those buildings. So things like utilities, stormwater, healthcare, transportation. Reduced generation of hydroelectric power during periods of drought, which could increase demand on natural gas and coal-fired power plants. That's a crossover with mitigation, not entirely adaptation. And changes in patterns of energy demand, so either increases or decreases due to changes in population dynamics as well as warming temperatures. Waste management, so that includes solid waste and recycling in this section. So some potential vulnerabilities would be an increased need for odor abatement as temperature increases, increased pest activity and altered waste decomposition rates as temperature increases, flooding and destruction of dump sites, collection systems, drainage systems, and management facilities, which could all lead to a decrease in capacity and management options. And existing concerns with pollution and the quality of city water could also be exacerbated by increased precipitation and extreme heat, and the impacts that that have on waterborne disease, and then runoff, nutrient runoff, and debris and waste from dump sites. So for water and wastewater, you would see potentially increased evaporation rates, which can reduce water supply and quality. Also, another thing that reduces water quality is increased risk of harmful algal blooms, especially when water temperatures are very high. Localized flooding during periods of heavy rain, especially where the city's stormwater infrastructure might be inadequate for increased volumes of stormwater, or where impermeable surfaces prevent infiltration. Increased occurrence and mobility of waterborne disease. Depletion of aquifer and reservoirs during periods of drought, which reduces drinking water supplies, even as sort of demand for water increases during drought times. And then increasing issues with failing septic systems that might not be designed for changing environmental conditions. So for health and safety, increased air pollution, so things like fine particulate matter and ground level ozone, and that impacts respiratory and cardiovascular health, especially for at-risk individuals like children, seniors, and folks with chronic health conditions. Increases in heat-related illness and death, which are often exacerbated by pre-existing medical conditions, age, occupation, and socioeconomic variables, like whether you have access to a vehicle or regular healthcare. Increased incidence of mold in homes that can lead to health conditions. Reduced water quality and higher risk of waterborne disease outbreaks. Increased concentrations of pollutants due to reduced river levels and flows. And then extreme events can also cause a disruption in sort of the usual daily responsibilities and priorities as people need to address emergencies, and that can place additional strain on healthcare staff, leading to sort of exacerbation of existing capacity issues. So for local food and agriculture, is where you'd see increased length of the growing season, and then potential increases in heat stress, disease, insect pests, invasive plants, weed growth, and all of that can impact the growth and productivity of agricultural crops, as well as native vegetation, of course. Increased need for supplemental watering during periods of extreme heat and drought. Increased flooding and erosion of agricultural lands that might be located near rivers or floodplains, and that can result in crop failures or damage or destruction of infrastructure associated with agricultural areas. Decreased water availability and quality. And then because there are already very few areas of undeveloped land in the city, the loss of additional agricultural land as a result of expanding floodplains, contamination, or sort of other climate issues would be a challenge, because you don't necessarily have additional undeveloped areas that you can bring in. Someone mentions pollinators. Yeah, that's a great one. I don't think that's in the vulnerability assessment. I'm gonna write it down. Okay. So for green space and tree canopy, so this includes urban street trees, parks, open space areas, conservation lands. A lot of the local food and agriculture ones apply here. So things like changes in the length of the growing season. I didn't repeat that on this slide, but they apply and they're sort of in the vulnerability assessment. But you would also see potentially a huge increase in non-native invasive plants and insect pests that can really affect native plant communities. Shifts in the composition and distribution of native plants due to changes in temperature and precipitation. Saw a conversation in the chat earlier. So changes in the range of trees that can survive, and then of course cascading impacts on all of the insect spurs and sort of other life forms that have evolved with that particular set of species. Changes in patterns of human demand for recreational spaces or other sort of aspects of green space. So you might see more people using areas that provide a lot of shade or have water features. Increased risk of harmful algal blooms, which impacts aquatic systems, so rivers, lakes, and ponds, and everything that lives there, as well as people, can cause things like respiratory distress. And then also increased stress on existing capacity needs to maintain parks and open space facilities, future demand for land, increased use of parks and open spaces, and climate change impacts all sort of work together to increase, to sort of enhance the capacity issues that might already be there. And then the last sector is the economy. So changes in costs of heating and cooling, which can impact business expenses. So increased risks for outdoor workers that are more exposed to heat or other hazards can reduce labor productivity. Damage as a result of flooding or other sort of extreme events can increase maintenance, insurance issues, and can affect sort of the continuity of services provided. Drought can cause water levels to drop in the Mississippi River, which can create places for barges to run aground and lead to problems for travel and goods transport locally, and then also sort of broader supply chain issues regionally and nationally for that matter. And then increased risk of damage and disruption to transportation and businesses due to infrastructure failure, especially where sort of aging infrastructure or infrastructure might not be adequate to deal with sort of future climate conditions, as well as more extended time and costs needed for recovery after a disaster. There's a question, do we ever get to think about how this impacts wildlife, birds, and fish? Yes, the green space and tree canopy group would be that spot. Although, you know, again, we're wanting to bring everything back to sort of the responsibilities of the city of La Crosse, but the green space and tree canopy group is the one that is sort of thinking about natural spaces and sort of ecosystems. All right, so I wanted to ask you all to name an additional vulnerability you're concerned about. You've already been doing this beautifully in the chat, but if anyone wants to add any others for us all to have examples, please feel free. And then we will also bring all of these ideas to the breakout group session, which is next. And that's where you'll also get to see sort of the full tables of all the things that I didn't include on these slides. And we can also use this time for any questions that anyone has specifically about this information, especially before we move into the breakout groups, if there's anything you want to sort of get clear on for about anything that we've talked about so far. Do fuel costs count as a vulnerability? That's a great question. Yes, I think fuel costs would count as a vulnerability, especially, you know, it places, if you see rising fuel costs as a result of climate events, especially extreme events, maybe that have impacts on, what's it called, the sort of fuel supply chain. But as we've seen sort of with big storms last year in Texas, that absolutely would count as a vulnerability. You can place a real hardship on businesses, on residents, on local supply chain issues, on the economy, all of those things. Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, larger rain events causing erosion of green spaces, river water temperatures, sedimentation. Yep, those are great ones. All right. I'm going to give it another minute for questions. And then have any questions, speak up. Then we can move into taking our break. We're running a little bit early, which is great because that means that we will have more time in our breakout groups for these discussions, which are a really fun place to have them. All right, so let's take a break. Let's reconvene at 12:31 your time. And if you are able to stay logged in, just turn off your mic and your video. And then when we come back, I will go over what the breakout group activity will be, and then we'll move right into the breakout groups. Thanks, everyone. Well, thanks, Ted. One note, Ted, is that the breakout groups won't record unless each of the facilitators separately records them. Do you want us to do that? Or do you want to just record this main part?
That is correct. We would have to record individually. I would think we're probably okay not recording it, and we can, because we have the report out, so we'll record that, and that'll probably suffice.
Okay, great. Good to know. Thanks. Okay, so I am going to get started on this next bit, which is just going to be explaining what we're going to be doing in our breakout groups. So we're going to spend the whole second half of this workshop working together in breakout groups, and we're going to be getting some input from you all on what you think the key vulnerabilities are for the community of Crosse. And then additional information on vulnerability within each of the 9 different sectors that we're considering. So these same sectors we just went over. We're going to be dividing up into 3 groups, and each of the groups will consider 3 of the sectors. These are the same groups of sectors that Ted used, I believe. So hopefully that will make it simpler for people's brains. So for each of the sectors, you're going to be working in your small group. And the first thing you're going to do is review this complete table of vulnerabilities. So what I gave you in the last presentation was just a selection of 4 or 5 of the bullet points from this longer table. So the facilitator in your group is going to share their screen with this table, and you'll all read it together so that you know what is there. And the facilitator will also be taking notes for all of your group's work, so you don't need to worry about filling anything out or writing anything down unless you want to do that for your own reasons. So you're going to look at this table together, and then you can add additional vulnerabilities that you can think of that aren't already here into the extra spaces. You can cross out anything that you don't think applies to La Crosse. If there's something in here and you're like, that's definitely not going to be a thing for us, then by all means, let us know. And then as a group, you're going to decide on 2 or 3 of these bullets that you think are the key vulnerabilities for La Crosse, specifically as they relate to this sector. So for land use and housing, what are the 2 or 3 bullets that you think are going to be the biggest issues? It's not saying that the other ones aren't important or that they won't affect the community, but what do you think the sort of things that are going to bubble to the top or the most urgent priorities should be? So for instance, you might decide, I made this up, but you might decide that increased heat stress in developed areas and reductions in the suitability of certain areas for some land uses are going to be the 2 biggest vulnerabilities for land use and housing sector in La Crosse. So in order to get to those 2 or 3 key vulnerabilities that your group comes to a consensus on, you're going to talk together about that. But one way that your group might sort of narrow it down is to use the annotate tool in Zoom, which I think is very fun. So if you haven't used it before, I wanted to show the whole group how to use that. It basically lets you put little stickers or stamps onto whatever is being shared on the screen so that everyone can see it. And it's very much akin to using those sort of sticky dots on poster board that we all used to do when we had workshops in person. So, if you're going to use the annotate tool, your group might decide you don't want to, and that's fine. But your facilitator would zoom out. After you've read through all the bullets, your facilitator would zoom out so they're all visible on the screen. They'll be small. But it's just for a few minutes and you'll have already read through them. And then in the toolbar at the top of your Zoom screen, you'll see the annotate button. So you would click on that. And then you'd see this annotate toolbar And if you click on the stamp button, you get the option to choose a stamp. And then you can put it anywhere on the screen and it will be visible to everyone. So everyone can try that right now, see what it's like. I think it's really fun. So you're going to go up to the top, click on the annotate button in the little toolbar, and then click on the stamp button. You can get a check mark, an arrow, a heart. There we go. Yeah. So you could, for instance, I'm going to use this check mark. You could say, here's my, whoa boy, sorry. Oh, I can't do it because I'm sharing my screen. Sorry about that. I can't show you. Anyway, you would put it right by the bullet that you want. And then afterwards, your facilitator can sort of count them up and see, if there are any that are definitely, yeah, exactly, any that are clear winners. And then you don't have to, as a group, talk about ones that no one really thinks are an issue. And I think it will help the conversation go a little bit faster.
Excuse me, Laura.
Yeah.
I have to break silence here. Where is the toolbar access? I don't find that on my.
So it should be at the, actually, Laura, can you say, because I'm sharing my screen and I don't know if it shows up differently for me.
Yep. Hold on one sec. Trying to unmute and turn my video on and all my things keep popping up. Try going in under, go up to the top where it says view options right next to where you're seeing the screen. And there's a choice that says annotate.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, and I see there's some people on phones. If that is the case, I'm sorry you don't get to join in the fun, and we can, people can put in chat if your annotate isn't working, or you can speak up on the phone and we'll sort of check in with you and find out what you want to vote for. And, once these votes are in, there's going to be a discussion as well. So this is not the be all and end all. So we'll try to make sure that everyone can participate in the way that works for them technologically.
And in the small groups, absolutely feel free to just verbalize.
Yeah,
and your
right.
facilitator can just type the information you want to share in.
Exactly.
Yeah, we will be small enough groups that that should be the first course of action. But if for some reason you are shy or don't feel like you want to, don't feel like talking, you don't have to, you can use the annotate.
Yep, exactly. Okay, so I'm going to stop your annotating. I've mostly got it figured out. So that's great. All right. And I will move on to the next. Yeah, so you're basically going to work together with your group. You're going to get a sense of what everyone is thinking, and then you're going to discuss it until you come to a consensus on what the 2 or 3 top vulnerabilities or key vulnerabilities are for this sector for La Crosse. It's sometimes easy to get distracted and be thinking about other sectors, especially when there's lots of crossover. Crossover is fine, but you are going to completely embody the interests of land use and housing or public health or the economy or whatever, and you're going to be thinking about it from that point of view. But do feel free to acknowledge and note, those sort of cross-sectoral things as well. So once you've identified your top 2 or 3 vulnerabilities, your facilitator is going to put them into this little table here, like that. These are the same 2 I mentioned earlier. I made up all of these examples. This is not necessarily what this group is going to choose, so please don't hold me to this. And so then once you've done that, you can use the remaining time that you have for that sector. I think we are going to probably have about 25 minutes, maybe a touch more to talk about each of these sectors. And you're going to be talking about these questions, these ABC questions, as it relates to these key vulnerabilities. So the first question is, are there locations or seasons where this is likely to be a greater concern, or populations that might be impacted to a greater degree? So you might say, this is made up. Yes, there are apartment complexes near downtown, and they're right next to the river, and I think they might be particularly impacted by this, or places where we want to develop apartment complexes. So the second question is this already occurring in your community? Are you already observing this vulnerability playing out? Is anyone already doing anything to address it? So you might say, oh yes, like neighborhoods that are in and around this particular marsh are already experiencing severe flooding in the spring. So further developing that area might not be possible. And then the last question is, would it be difficult for the community to address this, or what are the factors that might make it difficult to address? Or the flip side of that, which is, are there any community strengths that might make it more possible to address this? So you might say, yeah, like there are already current zoning policies and they don't consider future flooding risk. They only think about if an area has flooded historically. And those would be really difficult to update. Or you might say, oh yes, there's this amazing little grassroots organization that is pushing for changes in zoning policies, and we could leverage that. Would be an example of a strength. So you're probably not going to have time to address all three of these questions for each of the 2 or 3 vulnerabilities in each of the 3 sectors that you're talking about, and that's totally fine. You don't need to feel like you have to try to completely address all of these. I want you to approach it in whatever way works the best for your group. So you can go through all 3 questions for one vulnerability. You can and see how far you get. You can jump around depending on what information feels the most pressing to capture here. Also, at the end of the day, I'm going to give you my email address. So if there are things that come to you later or that you didn't get a chance to say or didn't want to say, you can send them to me in the next day or 2, and I will add that information as well. So we are going to go ahead and divide it up into our 3 groups. These are the sectors that each of the group is going to have and their facilitator. They're the same sectors and the same groups, as I mentioned, that Ted already created for the rest of the process. So hopefully they look familiar and you've already been thinking about which ones you're interested in and what you could contribute to the different groups. There should be something in each of these breakdowns that people can feel like they can contribute to. Catherine's going to open the groups. You can choose which breakout group you go to, but I do request that you try to spread yourself out so that we don't have one group with just a couple people and another with tons of people. If you see one group, well, I think we have 20, how many people are in here? No, there's 20 something people. So I would expect at least 6 to 8 people in each of the groups. So if you see one that's almost full and one that doesn't have many, please help your community and spread yourselves out so that we can get input on all these different sectors. Okay, Catherine, I think that you can open them. Oh, and here, I'll put this back. Can you see that? I'll put that back up while you're choosing your groups so that you can remember which ones are which. Conversations. We're good. I enjoyed ours a lot. We didn't get quite as far as I wished that we could, but I think that's always the case, especially for this workshop, which is extremely condensed. But I got a lot of good feedback I'll be incorporating, so I think it was on the right track. So the next thing that we want to do is we just want to hear from each group and get and have you share with us one of your key vulnerabilities. I would love to do all of them, but we have to go through all 9 sectors in a pretty short amount of time. And so I don't want us to, the last thing I want to do is keep you late. So your facilitators have added them to a Google Doc. So I'm going to share it on my screen, and then we'll have one representative from each group talk about your group. So let me share my screen. All right, can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. So my group was group 1. We did land use and housing, transportation and mobility, and buildings and energy. And Kathy, I think you were going to share what our top vulnerabilities are.
So one vulnerability from each section, land use and housing, high energy demand due to hotter summers and more extreme heat, transportation and mobility, increased flooding and associated damage to streets, sidewalks, trails, etc. during heavy rain events, and buildings and energy, increased damage to buildings and associated infrastructure. And that means everything from power lines, substations, transformers, but also water lines, sewer lines, etc.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. Does anyone from my group want to add anything? And I'm trying to figure out how to enlarge my screen. Should be under view.
Go to the 100% that's right under view.
Oh, thanks.
Sure.
There we go. Anyone else from my group want to add anything? Well, I will add that we mostly didn't have time to like go on to the A, B, and C questions, except for the last sector. And we had a really great, interesting discussion about all the things that La Crosse is already doing to address flooding damage in particular, which I found really useful. And then also, of course, some of the challenges associated with that. All right, let's go to group 2. I will go down as the group 2 person talks. I don't want to make it too small.
Excellent. Shar, the floor is yours.
Oh, lucky me. For waste management, our key vulnerability, boy, that's going to be difficult for me. Increased leakage and runoff, potentially impacting the local water quality. We have year-round rain, or year-round we have additional rain, winter rains that affect our marsh, rivers, the ground infiltration, and then have a high population, especially of rentals. Do I do all 3 of these, or just 1 or 2, or just highlight them?
All 3 of those.
Okay.
A, B, and C.
Yeah, and then we're already doing we are seeing things like dumpsters in the downtown area with grease that's running off of them, like from restaurants and such. We're replacing drainage systems in the older parts of town, retention ponds, things like that, to help with water, the water drainage. Education of renters on proper waste disposal would be something we're working on, and just education overall to residents. The infrastructure solutions we have are very good. Let's see, education, community is hard, requiring changing habits. We all know how difficult that is. Community strengths, we are in the process of hiring a communications director, and their job is going to be community engagement. Water utility and the sewer utility all work together with the street department, and we all try to work together to on the education and to make sure that we're doing things the way they should be. And then for water and wastewater, we have a lot of widespread flooding through the city. Lot more like quick bursts of water, instead of a 8-hour storm, it's like tons of water all quick. The stormwater modeling has been completed for the city. We have ID'd areas to improve the system. North side of town, because it's closest to the groundwater. There's a lot of intersection flooding. Water and sewer are leading our leads in things that we that we have been identified and that we're increasing and doing. A stormwater utility was created to fund the work that is being done. They're working towards grants and matching them. Just changing residents' behaviors is going to be very difficult, is one of the goals that we need to work on also. And then with health and safety, the increase in the heat and the cold related to illness and death, a lot of times is increased by pre-existing medical conditions, age, occupation, socioeconomic economic variables. Summer as well as the coldest winters, coldest events in the winter will make an impact. The lack of snow, believe it or not, decreases insulation to the pipes coming into homes. So so that is an impact, especially in the winter. The unsheltered community, more winter ice and rain than snow increases the danger of creates more danger. Heat has not been a problem, but older homes that are not comfortable during the dramatic heat and cold. So we're, looking, if you got bad windows, you're not gonna be able to keep the house warm or cooler in the summer. Yes, used to the cold. Someone had mentioned, we're the community impact. We're so used to the cold, so we learn to layer and get better at staying warm and finding ways to stay warm or cool off. There are weatherization programs for existing homes to help with the heat and the cold on the side.
Great, thanks. Does anyone else from that group want to add anything? Hey, thanks. That was really interesting and helpful. Group 3.
Right. Our key vulnerability for local food and agriculture was that current crops may not be suited for new conditions, which could require a change in what we grow and the equipment needed to grow those new crops and a different cultivation process. So one of the impacts we were looking at was our among Amish and Indigenous communities. But as they are currently adapting, they also offer an opportunity to learn how to address some of the concerns. And one of the things we need to work on is adjusting our eating habits, educating community where our food comes from, including local meat options, preserving local foods, vertical growing, and also the impact of pesticide use. One of the nice things about our area is there's a lot of small farmers, so it helps with diversity and therefore helping with resilience and allowing those smaller farmers to adapt better. Our key vulnerability in green space in the tree canopy is the expansion of non-native invasive plants and insect pests as temperatures increase, particularly winter temperatures. And our key vulnerability for the climate economy is increased demand on electrical grids, which increase costs and could result in more frequent power outages that impact businesses and industries. I would also like to add one thing we talked about is our outdoor recreation, the economy related to that, especially with our winter sports and likelihood of that being impacted, such as our ski hills, our skating, and our ice fishing. Yeah, so thank you.
Great, thank you. Anyone from that group want to add anything to what Lewis said? Okay. All right. Let me grab the last slides. I guess before I do this, does anyone want to say anything or share anything about sort of overarching thoughts or trends that you've noticed now that we've sort of heard a little bit from all the groups? Does anyone have sort of final thoughts or themes that made you think of, or connections that you want to make? We have definitely enough time if there are things that folks want to say before we get there.
Definitely those cross-sectoral issues that were brought up. If you can see them, if you can see some of those quite clearly from what people reported back that weren't in what was reported from your group, that would be great.
Yeah.
Agreed. And then one of the things I was thinking about too is when we were talking about green space and canopy, I was thinking about how useful that is for transportation, for like people walking around, and how that really helps with, you know, encouraging people to get outside and walk. The other thing I think that I thought about before in terms of adaptation is like a lot of climate change seems really overwhelming. And it's like, what, I mean, for the stuff that we can't change or can't fix or can't help, what do we do? And I think one of the things maybe that could frame some of our discussions is just like we coming at it from a point of compassion, and just like, you know, there's a lot of things that we're not going to be able to help or not going to be able to fix or solve in time. So making sure that people are taken care of, I think, is really an important part of adaptation.
Yeah, it really is. That's a great way to think about it. I'm writing that down. Kathy, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just hope that, I mean, talking about all this stuff, we see how connected things are, and sometimes connections that we weren't thinking of before come clear. And so I hope this whole process helps us to think differently about everything. Like I keep hearing, you know, this solar field is enough to power 4,000 homes. But if those 4,000 homes were super energy efficient, it could be 16,000 homes. So I think we have to look at the second and third level underneath stuff as we're talking about and thinking about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And from an adaptation point of view, if those 4,000 homes are located in a place where they're going to be wiped out by severe flooding, it won't matter either. So yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Anything else? I see thumbs up. Okay. So the last thing, oh, hang tight. Every time I have to figure this out. Let's see. All right. Okay. All right. So the last couple of minutes is just to wrap up, and I want to just reorient you all to what's going to happen next. I'm so grateful to have all of your input. This is going to help a lot. So the next thing that's going to happen is that if you want to send anything, any other thoughts or comments, things that you didn't get a chance to say, or questions that your group didn't have time to answer, please feel free to email them to me. But I need to receive them by the end of the day on Friday, because I'm trying to get this sort of finalized and sent back out to you as quickly as I can. So tomorrow and Friday, tomorrow and Friday, feel free to send them to me. Laura or Catherine, can you put my email address into the chat box so that people can copy and paste it easily? So please feel free to send that along, and I will make sure it is included along with all of the other input that you gave today. So over the next week or so, I'm going to incorporate all of the information and the key vulnerability factors that you selected into the vulnerability assessment, and then finalize it, and then Ted will send it out to everyone. I'm aiming to do that by mid-February. And then so there's that. And then we're going to continue working with this information, as you said, sort of making connections and bringing this sort of information and mindset forward into the whole rest of the process as you identify strategic goals and actions, and then implement them eventually. And then I think Ted is going to tell you about the next bit from his point of view.
I am. I'm just gonna just wanted to sort of. I always end each of our meetings with just sort of a reminder. There might be a little bit of to do, and then a reminder on kind of where our next meetings are, just so that continues to stay on everybody's radar. So first, the to do that there is just in case you have not had the opportunity yet. Please make sure that you sign up for the sub-team groups that you are interested in. Remember that you're looking for one sub-team in each of the 3 groupings. There's I think a green colored grouping, a blue colored grouping, and a reddish colored grouping, I think, or maybe one's yellow. Either way, one team in each one of those 3 clusters. That'd be great. I will send out a follow-up email following this meeting, and I'll give you a link just to make sure you've got it. As I was indicating, the baseline documents are going to be issued here next week with vulnerability assessment, as Laura said, might be mid-February, so it might be the week following. So in the next 2 weeks, all of the baseline documents are going to be coming out, which will give you opportunities to kind of glean through all the background research that we have been doing, greenhouse gas inventory, ground cover assessment, etc. So our next meeting is our goal setting workshop. It'll kind of continue sort of similar to this, except for we're going to be looking at mitigation and adaptation, and we're going to be doing it as sub teams. So each sector is going to be getting together. All of our meetings henceforth, as you sign up for sub teams, those will be the topics that you will get into small groups on. So it's going to be a little bit different from today, similar, but a little bit different. It's going to be, you're going to be focused in on a specific topic for each breakout round. So we're going to have our goal setting meeting that's set up for 2 weeks from today. That's an 11 a.m. start. And I also want to flag and apologize. My last email that went out, I had the darn times wrong. I had them all set up as the same time. You will find in your meeting invites, if you've accepted all of the meetings, those hopefully are showing up in your schedule. And you'll find that the meeting invites are correct, but my email was incorrect. And the correct times are noted here. And I'm just going to keep it just like that in all of our agendas, so we have them in front of us. So the second is an 11 a.m. start. The next meeting after that is on March 9th, and that's going to be a 3:30 p.m. start. So I'm sorry about my mistake earlier. So I'm going to summarize just these little couple tidbits in an email out to the full team. And in that email, I'll be including these proper start times as a reminder. In the meantime, if anybody has any questions or troubles whatsoever, feel free to let me know. And I think that's pretty much all that we had from our side. And I'll just sort of open it up. I don't know, Mackenzie or Lewis, if you have anything you want to share as we end. And I'm kind of putting you on the spot because we didn't give you a heads up that maybe that'd be an opportunity. So no is okay.
Oh, just thanks everybody for coming today.
Yes, thank you, everybody. I'm sorry I had to miss the first half, but it was such a rewarding experience to speak with everybody in the subgroups, and I'm really enjoying the process. And thanks so much to EcoAdapt and to Pale Blue Dot and all of you folks organizing all of this and keeping it streamlined. It's really nice.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you all very much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.